That night the air felt warmer than usual. It was as if something was trying to sneak into my heart. I stopped dead in my tracks as I passed a slightly ajar door. The dim light from within seemed to call out to me, not with a voice, but with a curiosity I couldn't resist. I didn't intend to look, but my eyes seemed to have a will of their own. And in a second that felt like an eternity, I saw something I shouldn't have seen. My mother-in-law was alone in her room, holding her own hand. My name is Bai. If anyone were to look at my life from the outs, they would probably say I'm a lucky man. I have a beautiful, gentle wife who always tries to understand all my shortcomings. Lila. Our marriage wasn't long. It's only been almost a year, but it feels like we've known each other our whole lives. After we got married, we decided to live temporarily at Lila's parents' house. It wasn't without reason. Our financial situation wasn't stable enough to immediately buy or rent our own house. Me, who was still starting my career, and Lila, who occasionally helped with a small business from home, made us agree to be patient for now. The house was quite large and warm, not only physically, but also emotionally. It was there that I got to know my mother-in-law, whom I had only known briefly before we were married. Mrs. Ratna. Mrs. Ratna was the type of woman who was hard to dislike. Her demeanor was calm, her words were gentle, and her way of treating others was always attentive. From the first time I lived there, she never made me feel like an outsider. On the contrary, she treated me like her own child. Every morning, before I left for work, there was always a cup of hot coffee on the dining table, sometimes accompanied by a simple breakfast that she prepared with great sincerity. Don't forget to eat, Bayou. Work is important, but health is more important. She said so one morning, with a smile that made me feel appreciated. I could only smile and nod. It was little things like that that slowly made me feel comfortable living in that house. My days went by at a fairly consistent rhythm. Waking up in the morning, having breakfast together, then leaving for work. In the afternoon or evening, I would come home to Lila, who was always waiting for me with light stories about her day. Sometimes we had dinner together with Mrs. Ratna. Sometimes just the two of us in the room, joking about trivial things. Nothing was strange. Nothing felt out of place. Everything was going as it should. But if I'm honest, there was one thing that crossed my mind a few times. It wasn't anything major, just a vague feeling that was hard to explain. I was starting to realize that Mrs. Ratna wasn't just a good mother. She was also a woman who still looked graceful even at her age. Her way of dressing was always neat, simple yet classy. Her face held traces of beauty that hadn't faded with time. At first, I didn't think it was anything important. To me, it was just a simple form of appreciation. It was normal, wasn't it? Acknowledging that someone looked good without any other motive behind it. I tried to convince myself that, and for months I never gave it any further thought. I kept my cool, maintained my boundaries, and positioned myself as a daughter-in-law who respected her mother-in-law. Until one day, I began to realize that this comfort was slowly turning into something more complicated. Not because of anything major, not because of any conflict, but because of a small shift in my own way of thinking. I was starting to be more sensitive to things I'd never noticed before. The way Mrs. Ratna spoke, the way she smiled, even her mere presence in the same room with me sometimes made the atmosphere feel different. I had ignored those feelings, dismissing them as unimportant. After all, I had Lila, my wife, the woman I loved, and I didn't want to ruin everything we'd built just because of feelings that weren't even real. So I chose to continue living as usual, being the same old Bayou, a loyal husband, a self-aware son-in-law, not realizing that a small, seemingly trivial moment would soon test all my beliefs. A silent night, a dark hallway, and a door that shouldn't be open. That night, I came home later than usual. The street was deserted, and my thoughts were filled with exhaustion after a long day of nonstop work. When I entered the house, it was so quiet. The living room lights had been turned off, leaving only the dim light from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I walked slowly, trying not to make a sound. My shoes were off, my footsteps were quiet so as not to make any noise. Lila must have been asleep, so was Mrs. Ratna. But as I passed the hallway, my steps stopped. Mrs. Ratna's door was slightly ajar. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe he forgot to close it or left it open on purpose because of the stifling night air. Damen. I even intended to close it gently, just to make sure he was comfortable. But as I approached, the light from inside the room fell directly on my face, as if it had caught my attention without permission. Reflexively, my eyes glanced inside, just for a glance, just a split second. But that 1 second felt like an eternity. I immediately froze. My heart was beating faster than usual. My breath was held. My body felt like it had lost control. Oh my God, what did I just see? I muttered to myself. I didn't move, didn't enter, didn't leave immediately. It was as if something was holding me there. Not out of desire, but because of the shock that was too deep. However, my consciousness returned in an instant. I quickly looked down, turned my face away, then stepped back hurriedly. My hands were even shaking as I tried to open my own bedroom door. Once inside, I immediately closed the door tightly. I leaned against it, taking a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Tikimam. This was wrong. This was completely wrong. I covered my face with both hands. My mind was in chaos. I never intended to see anything. Never. But the fact that I had seen it was something I couldn't erase. The image kept appearing in my head. It was clear. Too clear. I tried to distract myself. I tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, the moment replayed itself, like a scene playing over and over again. I felt guilty. So guilty. As a daughter-in-law, I should have maintained boundaries, maintained my behavior, and guarded my gaze. But tonight, I felt like I had violated something invisible, yet very real. And what was more frightening wasn't just the guilt, but another feeling that was slowly emerging without my control. A feeling that made me even more afraid of myself. I opened my eyes, staring at the dark ceiling. Beside me, Lila was fast asleep. Her face was so peaceful I didn't know what was going on in my mind. The guilt deepened and I have to forget this. I have to. I whispered softly. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something that would just disappear. And without me realizing it, that one small incident had opened another door in my life. A door that carried not only secrets, but also a conflict that was slowly eating away at me from within. Since that night, my life has been different, and I still wake up early, still sit at the dining table, still go to work like an unchanging routine. But there's one thing that's different. Myself. Every time I see Mrs. Ratna, something flutters in my chest. Not because of what she did, but because of what I've seen. And worse, because I can't forget her. Bayou, I've made the coffee. Drink it first before it gets cold, Mrs. Ratna said one morning in her characteristically soft voice. I, sitting there, immediately flinched slightly. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, I replied briefly, trying to sound normal. However, I didn't dare look her in the eye for too long. I was afraid. Afraid that she would notice something. Afraid that my expression would change. Afraid that everything I've been keeping inside would show on my face. From then on, I started to distance myself. I often locked myself in my room, avoiding long conversations. I even deliberately left early and came home late just to minimize interaction. Leela noticed, "Why do you seem different lately?" he asked one night while looking at me suspiciously. I was silent for a moment. "Maybe just tired from work," I answered casually. He didn't immediately believe me, but he didn't force it either. And that's where my guilt piled up. I wasn't just keeping secrets, but I was also starting to lie to the person I loved most. Day after day passed, but instead of getting better, things were getting more complicated because it turned out avoiding wasn't the solution. The more I tried to stay away, the more my mind was filled with that image. Even in the simplest of situations. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The house looked deserted.
I thought no one was there. But when I stepped into the living room, I saw Mrs. Ratna sitting alone. We stared at each other. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. "What's wrong, Yoke? Tuman came home early," he asked in a casual tone, as if nothing had happened. "Yes, Mom. Work's been quiet," I answered nervously. I wanted to immediately go into the room, avoiding her as usual. But my step stopped when he spoke again. "Bayu." I turned my head slowly. "Mom, feels like you've been distant lately. Is there something on your mind?" The question stabbed right into my heart. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what to answer. "No, ma'am. I just have a lot on my mind." I lied again. Mrs. Ratna stared at me more deeply, a look that was hard for me to interpret. Not angry, not suspicious, but as if understanding something that was unspoken. And that was what made me even more uncomfortable. From that moment on, I realized one thing. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep hiding behind excuses, behind distance, behind the little lies that kept piling up. I had to do something. I had to end all of this, erase that shadow, return everything to how it was before, whatever it took. But the reality wasn't that easy, because the more I tried to fight, the stronger the feeling pressed from within. And for the first time in my life, I felt defeated by my own thoughts, trapped between guilt and something that shouldn't have grown. And I knew if I didn't make a decision soon, everything could be destroyed. Not only myself, but also the household that I had maintained with all my heart. That day finally came, sooner than I had hoped. The afternoon was approaching evening. The sky outside looked cloudy. Lila excused herself from going out since noon to meet her friend. She said she had something important to do. I just nodded without asking much. I thought I would use that time to rest. But I was wrong. The house that usually felt warm suddenly became too quiet. And in that silence there were only me and Mrs. Ratna. I was sitting in the living room, trying to focus on my phone, even though my mind was actually wandering everywhere, until finally the sound of soft footsteps came from the direction of the kitchen. I knew who it was. I held my breath for a moment. "Bayu." The voice called softly, but enough to make my heart beat faster. I lifted my head. Mrs. Ratna was standing a few steps away. "Yes, ma'am," I answered, trying to be as calm as possible. "I want to talk to you for a moment. Can I?" she said. Her tone was different from usual. More serious. Deeper. I swallowed hard. "Yes, I can, ma'am." She sat in the chair across from me. Our distance wasn't too far, but somehow it felt so narrow. Silence. A few seconds passed without a word. I could hear my own heartbeat. "Bayu," she began. Slowly. "Be careful. I might be wrong, but I feel you've changed since some time ago." I kept quiet and didn't answer. And Mom also felt it had something to do with that night. The sentence was like a bolt of lightning striking me. I froze. My hands immediately went cold. So she knew, or at least she realized something. Something. I looked down, unable to look at her. The atmosphere grew heavier. My voice choked. I'm sorry, Mom. That was all I could get out of my mouth. All the walls I'd built up all this time collapsed in one sentence. I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't hide anymore. Mrs. Ratner didn't answer right away. She just took a deep breath. Mom, you're human too, Bayou, she said quietly. Sometimes we accidentally find ourselves in situations we don't want. I kept my head down. The guilt now felt many times heavier. I really didn't mean to, Mom. I never meant to. My voice began to tremble. Mom knew she cut me off. Gently. I fell silent. But what Mom was worried about wasn't what happened. She continued. But what you felt afterward. I immediately lifted my head. Startled. Mrs. Ratner's gaze was calm, but deep, as if it penetrated everything I'd been trying to hide. I couldn't avoid it again. At that point, I realized I was truly at the end. All attempts to avoid it had failed. All attempts to forget it had failed. And now I had only one last choice. The most difficult choice. I had to be completely honest, or I would continue to be trapped in this feeling until it finally broke the scale. I took a deep breath. My hands clenched. Mom, I said softly, in a voice that was almost inaudible.
I was afraid of myself. The words finally came out. And from that moment on, there was no going back to the way it was before. The room felt even narrower. The air seemed to stop moving. After those words left my mouth, I felt like I had lost my grip. I didn't know how Mrs. Ratner would respond. Angry, disappointed, or hate me. I lowered my head, not daring to look at her face. Several seconds passed, feeling like hours, until finally, the soft voice came back. Afraid because of Bayou. I bit my lip. The question was simple, but the answer felt so heavy. I'm afraid, because I can't control my thoughts, Mom. I said, honestly. My voice trembled. I hate this feeling, but I also can't lie that it's there. My tears began to well up, even though I held back as hard as I could. I knew this was wrong. I knew this shouldn't be happening, and that's what made me even more scared. I continued. Mrs. Ratner fell silent. I dared to lift my face slightly. She didn't look angry, nor disappointed like I'd imagined. Instead, there was a calm there. A calm that made me feel even smaller. Bayou? She said quietly. What you feel isn't something you planned. But what determines who you are is how you react to it. I stared at her, trying to digest every word. I don't see as wrong, she continued, but I'll be very sad if you choose to let those feelings control you. And the sentence felt like a slap to me, but in a way that made me look down. Again. This time it wasn't out of fear. It was because I was touched. I don't want to, Mom. I don't want to be that kind of person. I said quickly, I love Lila. I don't want to hurt her. Especially not Mom. My voice broke. For the first time since all this began, I was completely honest, not just with others, but with myself. Mrs. Ratner nodded slowly. Then you already know what you have to do, she said. I fell silent, And in that silence, I finally found the answer. I had to stop running. I had to stop suppressing everything alone. I had to get myself back to where I belonged. That night, I spent a long time in my room,
staring at Leela's sleeping face. The face that had always been there for me, but that I had almost betrayed with my own thoughts. Slowly, I held her hand. "Sorry," I whispered softly. Not because I had done something, but because I had almost stepped in the wrong direction. Since that night, I began to change. Not distance myself, but improve. I tried to open myself again, spend more time with Lila, be more honest with my own feelings, and most importantly, maintain boundaries more consciously, me. I no longer avoided Mrs. Ratna excessively, but I also didn't let my thoughts run wild. I learned to control myself. Day by day, it slowly felt lighter. The feeling didn't disappear immediately, but it no longer dominated me. And for the first time since the incident, I felt like I was myself again. But it turns out that being myself after everything that happened wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new understanding. The days that followed were calmer, but not without shadows of the past. There were small moments that still reminded me of that incident. The quiet hallway, the dim light, or even just footsteps at night. Shia, Shia. The difference this time was that I wasn't running anymore. I faced it with the realization that anyone can slip, even accidentally, but that doesn't mean they have to keep falling in the same place. My relationship with Lila slowly deepened. I began to be more open, more present, and more appreciative of every little thing I'd previously taken for granted. Her laughter, her attention, even the way she asked simple questions. Everything now felt so much more meaningful. One night, as we sat alone in our room, Lila stared at me for a long moment. "We're different now, aren't we?" she said quietly. I paused. "Different in what way?" I asked. "Warmer, more present," she replied with a small smile. It was a simple sentence, but enough to make my chest feel tight. Because I knew that change was born from a mistake that almost ruined everything. I smiled and took her hand. "Maybe I just realized what's truly important," I replied. "He doesn't know the real story, and maybe he doesn't need to know everything. Not to hide a lie, but to protect a heart that doesn't need to be hurt by something that's already over." Meanwhile, my relationship with Mrs. Ratna also changed. Not to become awkward, but more mature. We never discussed the incident again. Not with words, but with attitudes. There were boundaries that now felt clearer. There was a distance maintained consciously, not forced. And strangely, that's precisely where the respect grew stronger. One morning, as usual, I sat at the dining table. A cup of hot coffee was ready. "Drink it first, Bayu. It'll get cold," Mrs. Ratna said in the same tone as before. I stared at the cup for a moment and then smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Simple. But this time, without burden, without haunting guilt. Only gratitude that I didn't lose everything. Now, I understand one thing, that life doesn't always test us with big things. Sometimes it's from small, unintentional moments. One glance, one open door. And that's where everything can change. I've been at a point where I almost lost my way simply because I couldn't control my own thoughts. But I also learned that the courage to be honest, to admit, and to make amends is the only way back, Midek. That secret will probably always be there, tucked away in silence. But no longer as a burden, but as a reminder that guarding my heart is far more difficult than simply maintaining my attitude. And from that day on, I vowed never again to let one small moment destroy the life I'd worked so hard to build.